Yeah, be na dirt on by dirt on by Hi everyone, it's Elon Musk. No, I'm not trying to evade debt collectors, I'm good. Sure, my car is rusty, but rust gives it a special charm. And it's a special kind of car. It's the UnMusking Show, and I'm holding a traditional African mask. A wooden one, thankfully. As I've mentioned lately, I had some issues with things made out of metal. That's right, today we'll be talking about Africa. Why not, I don't know, the Antarctic, you may ask. Well, I haven't heard anything about the Antarctic lately, but Africa, on the other hand, is on everyone's minds. There's much to think about after all. The Niger coup, an ongoing military conflict in Mali, war and riots in Sudan, Central African Republic, and Burkina Faso, for instance. At the same time, African Union has been made a permanent member of the G20. Head of China visited the South African Republic, and U.S. Secretary of State traveled to Cabo Verde, Côte d'Ivoire, Nigeria, and Angola. Since when did world leaders turn their attention to the poor and desolate countries? Why are they so chummy with countries which possess no nuclear weapons? Since I'm an entrepreneur, things like canceling the debt of African nations, giving them grain, or launching humanitarian missions there don't make me go, makes me think, who's profiting from this? By the way, I was born and raised in South Africa, so I am quite inquisitive when I see someone interested in my homeland. Throughout the age of colonization, around 10 million black slaves were shipped off from Africa to the New World. Some places, such as Angola, were practically emptied of locals. The local elites also benefited from slave trade, as it was often them who sold their neighbors. Hence, there were no riots and no uprisings. On the contrary, the local legislature became more and more harsh, meaning that basically any transgression could mean the culprit was sold off to the white man. Sometime later, that is when they've earned enough money, Europe decided that slave trade is terrible. No, more. So instead of plucking slaves and shipping them off, Europe sliced Africa into colonies under total control of France, Spain, Great Britain, and other white nations. And then the old world really got carried away. And then, after beating Nazism, which split people into okay and not okay, Europe decided to act all ashamed and remorseful. So basically gave all African countries freedom. Some did it right away, others were not as generous, such as France with Algeria. 8 years of war, estimated over 1 million victims among the Algerian people, and 25,000 dead Frenchmen. This is the price Africa paid for France's imperial tendencies. It seemed that African nations were on the verge of prosperity after finally being given independence. They would show the whole world that they can offer more than malaria and slaves, as we can see by the number of African brands in our houses, on our roads, and bodies. Apparently they can't. The local elites simply took over the white masters and found a new way to profit. By selling raw materials, they quickly understood that these profits were not enough to make their citizens wealthy. So instead of growing local economies, they focused all their power on, staying in power. Sometimes they give these profits to those who have more guns and RPGs. Europe is, of course, saddened by the state of affairs, so it's showering the continent in humanitarian and financial aid. But who decides how this aid is utilized? Yes, the very same local elites, with the very same results. No economy means no taxes, no healthcare, no social benefits. That means no demographic transition, so the society is stuck with high birth rate and unemployment. Throngs of teenagers who can't afford Apple Vision Pro are faced with a choice: leave or pick up a gun. Military coups are more often encountered in Africa than ATMs.
Please type in your personal identification number. Oh, so it's you.
Then there are climate and environmental disasters, things like scorching heat, radical Islamic groups, AIDS, no educated class in the society, lack of drinking water, and electricity. It's as if someone imagined an investor's paradise and did the opposite. It seems like the powers that be should stay away from Africa. But, as we mentioned earlier, it's on the contrary. So which is it? Witchcraft of local shamans, or a feeling of guilt towards Africa over centuries of abuse? Europe? Feeling guilty? You've got to be kidding me. As always, it's about the resources. And, like centuries ago, Africa's main resource is people. It's the fastest growing region in the world. And by 2050, half of the world's population will live on this continent. Europe is already dealing with overwhelming immigration from Africa, and it's clear it will be unable to process hundreds of millions of newcomers. So we need to address the root cause of migration instead of dealing with the aftermath. Besides, Africa is actually becoming wealthier, slowly but surely. We have Europe and its social benefits immigrants send to their homelands to thank for that. And this means the region is becoming a valuable market for exporting goods from industrialized country. Congrats, my fellow Africans. You're becoming part of the consumer society. Get ready to use iPhones as payment for sex. Meanwhile, the developed nations have to be ready for a struggle to secure its influence over the continent. France historically held dominion over northern and central Africa back since colonial times. French is the primary language for many countries there. It can be easily seen at, Champs-Élysées or France national teams. Just watch an NBA or NFL game, you'll feel like you're also watching the France national team play. But today, France, and by extension Europe, is losing its hold over Africa. Algeria is asking for reparations from France for its colonial damages. Niger is refusing to export uranium, and the Sahel states are leaving ECOWAS. Russia is now attempting to take France's place. Its political advisors and mercenaries from the Wagner private military company are providing military support to the current regimes in Mali, Niger, Central African Republic. Moreover, they're expanding their sphere of influence to neighboring countries and are even blocking construction of a gas pipeline to the EU. Tucker Carlson, our expert on all things Russian, will tell us what the country is really after in Africa.
Russia goes its own way, always and everywhere. Usually, when a country is left alone against half the world, it starts looking for allies. Russia, on the other hand, decided to create its allies. Besides, its interests align with those of most African countries. Independence from Europe and the USA, economic development and integration, creation of common markets for resources, goods, and even financial services, expansion of the BRICS. And of course, there's the arms trade. Unlike Europe or the States, those Russians know how to make cheap guns. There's another bonus Russia is getting out of this: political support from African nations in the UN and other international organizations.
Yes, we know that everything is cheap in Russia. We've all seen your vids from Moscow.
Russia is famous for its bread, which is one thing I can assess pretty well.
So how did Russia become so buddy-buddy with Africa?
Echoes of the Soviet Union. During the Cold War, the Soviets exported to Africa not only socialism, but all kinds of weapons they were producing as well. More African kids are familiar with the AK than with Lego. I mean, there's even one depicted on Mozambique's flag.
Thank you, Tucker. This time you managed not to mention supermarkets and grocery prices. Political support and influence, resources, and potential export markets are sought after by everyone, so other countries set their sights on Africa as well. India is trying to get the continent dependent on its electronics, mechanical engineering, and telecom. Meanwhile, the United Arab Emirates is investing in the energy sector, agriculture, and tourism. It also provides humanitarian and social aid to its Muslim brethren. Turkey even launched Turkey's Opening to Africa, a policy aimed at bringing it closer to the continent. In 2003, Turkey only had 12 diplomatic missions in Africa, and today this number is 44. It should be noted that any infrastructural investment, even if it was free or provided as a low-interest loan, still requires maintenance. So, those countries and corporations which give Africa factories, production lines, technology, weapons, you name it, will soon be given contracts for maintenance, spare parts, and production supplies. Of course, this will be detrimental to domestic African industries. Yes, we're talking about China, largest investments, largest volume of trade. China works with Africa both through the government and through its corporations. They're buying ports, airports, building factories in Africa, and giving them their manufacturing processes. It should be noted that there is one thing China is cutting down on: loans. Since 2019, rates have gone up and the number and volume of loans have gone down. In fact, China is starting to become the world's largest debt collector. Debts are not crops. So what does my adopted country think about the homeland's peculiar situation? Naturally, the United States is not a fan that a bunch of countries it doesn't control is so invested in Africa. After the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and thus the end of its support to African countries, the US became disinterested in the continent, kind of like a toy you played out of spite, only because other kids wanted to play with it as well. Fast forward to today, Russia's expansion of its influence, China's stream of investments, and Europe's withdrawal from the region made Africa once again worthy of US attention. The US doesn't really understand what it is exactly that they need from Africa. But given their track record in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Yugoslavia, I'm kind of worried about what's in store for Africa. Antony Blinken toured Africa to persuade the local leaders that the United States was throwing their hat into the ring. Joe Biden also promised to visit the continent, but I guess he kind of forgot. Besides, Americans largely don't care what's going on in Africa. In any case, both the United States and Europe will have a hard time competing with these new investors. After all, neither China nor Russia, or other non-Western countries for that matter, are concerned with things like democracy or human rights. Instead, they work with the regimes that are capable of controlling resource extraction and arms trade. Ruling regimes in Africa is a whole other can of worms. Armed rebellions and coups are a regular occurrence in Africa, so the primary objective of any new regime is to stay in power. Developing the country is secondary. When you never really think long-term and nice guys with big fat wallets offer help, you know what happens? No, not prostitution. Debt happens. The African continent is the most indebted region on the planet. In other words, its debts cost it dearly. For instance, Kenya spends a whopping 60% of its budget just on its debts. Primary creditors are China, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund. China has lower rates, but unlike Western organizations, it's not ashamed of confiscating properties, I mean huge infrastructural facilities, as payment for its loans. Doom and gloom. These should be the words on Africa's coat of arms, if it had one. Actually, it's not as bad as it seems. Today, Africa has a real chance at turning towards a brighter future. Never before this many countries were interested in Africa as a partner and not a colony. After dealing with American slavery, European exploitation, Soviet socialism, and Chinese pragmatism, African nations have enough experience to choose their partners and balance between them, staying true to their own interests. Take Turkey, for example. It managed to become Russia's partner, while at the same time being a NATO member. And I'm free to do what I want. So let's try to adopt a creative approach to solving one of Africa's main problems. Periodic tables on assault rifles, basic economic concepts on RPGs, and throw some agile and scrum diagrams and bullet points on their tanks. You get the idea. You can teach Africans chemistry, physics, programming, and even culture and arts this way. Of course, someone will call it the shooting Louvre, but at least Africa will have the most educated warlords in the world. On a serious note, it's not quite clear which path the African countries will choose. Some are still squandering their resources and people, warring over profits from its raw materials. Others will become a new manufacturing haven with cheap labor, like China, but perhaps maybe more successful African states, such as South Africa, Botswana, and Morocco, will manage to share their experience with the whole continent and become the new powers that be. Most likely, all these scenarios will come to life. It won't be all smooth sailing. South America threw off its colonial shackles 150 years ago, and it's still mired in corruption, suffers from populism, and is controlled by autocratic elites. But at least it's not famine, war, and slavery. So let's wish Africa good luck and hope for the best. Maybe their spirits will help them. After all, unlike their former colonizers, the spirits don't ask much in return. Yeah, me, nah, yeah, me, do that.